Welcome, everybody. I'm Dr. Kirsten Lauritsen. Welcome back to the Cooking Show. This is a series that I have created to help explain and educate on detoxification and on health, and why so many eating certain ways and eating certain foods and creating a lifestyle that is healthy, why that's important. So today, and in this Cooking Show series, I'm going to have a series of interviews with physicians and professionals that are in the health world. And today I have Dr. Stephanie Halloran here with me, and she is a chiropractor and also she also got her master's in human nutrition and functional medicine from the University of Western States, just like I did. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about one of her final papers that she wrote that really highlights some important reasons and ways of why detoxification is really, really important, and how chemicals and toxins can affect our health in many different ways, but one of them being mental health. So Dr. Stephanie, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about what you do, and then also if you want to just segue into your paper, that sounds great to me.
Of course. So a little bit about my background. I went to University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana for undergrad. I got my degree in kinesiology. After that, had an idea I wanted to go to chiropractic school, but was not ready to take on the loans. So I went to back to the suburbs of Chicago, where I was from, worked as a personal trainer for 2 years, got a little stuck in that and the repetitiveness of working with people on just weight loss goals and having limitations in my credentials and being able to talk about the nutrition side of things. Absolutely. So decided to go back, went to University of Western States for chiropractic school. While I was there, I started the human nutrition and functional medicine program because I always had an interest in that area. And then after chiropractic school, I spent my last 3 months of school doing a preceptorship at the Indianapolis VA, and then continued on to do an optional residency at the VA in West Haven, Connecticut. So after my year there, I was offered an opportunity to work on a large research project funded by the National Institutes of Health looking at chiropractic dosage in low back pain. And so I've been working as a postdoctoral research fellow at Yale University in conjunction with the West Haven VA for the past year and a half or so.
Awesome.
During that time, I finished my master's in human nutrition and functional medicine. And that's where I came up with this paper. So the paper was focused, a hypothetical paper. So none of this is specifically researched in this population, but it was to look at the potential for polychlorinated biphenyl exposure, which is a type of persistent organic pollutant, and how it could potentially impact mental health within the veteran population, specifically those who were deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yep. So I think that's a really important point to kind of stress as far as this goes. Like, we can share some of the research that you used at the bottom of this video, but it is a hypothetical. It's not a published paper. We haven't really just necessarily studied per se some of these things. But let's talk a little bit about the main point of the paper kind of was, which was the fact that I think that when you are exposed to certain toxins and chemicals, they do have an impact on our body. And we are going to segue a bit into what kind of detoxification is, what toxin exposure is, and why that matters. But why don't you go ahead and kind of explain a little bit about what PCBs, so polychlorinated biphenyls, and those kinds of chemicals and toxins, what kind of impact they might have on the body.
So my idea for this paper started as I was looking into some toxic exposures in different areas, specifically POPs and how they could impact the body. And so there's something called the Stockholm Convention, which was in about the early 2000s is when they came into force, and a bunch of countries signed on to this treaty to say that they would eliminate POPs from the environment. The United States never signed on to the treaty, but they had taken steps akin to what the convention stated to eradicate them from use. So PCBs are one part of that. They are found in things like coolants
Mm-hmm.
and carbonless copy paper and plasticizers,
Yep.
some caulking materials, some wood floor finishing. It's not produced anymore, but if you have a home or something that used these materials prior to probably the 70s or 80s, it could be present.
Right.
So these are also found in transformers and different electrical things from way back in the day.
Right.
So these could be an issue because as they get released into the air, they hang out in the air for a long time. They don't really just dissipate. They have half-life about 10 to 15 years, and they're stored in adipose tissues for humans.
A long time. Yep.
A long time. So they can be excreted through feces, but that means that you have to break these down, pull them out of the fat cells and excrete them, which means you have to have good fat breakdown. You have to have good liver function. You have to be able to have good bowel movements to excrete them properly and timely. So there's a lot of things that play a role in that.
Right. Right. So that's actually a very great segue into, you talked a little bit more in this paper and specifically focused on veterans and their exposure overseas. So how why don't you talk a little bit more about the connection as far as how they could be potentially exposed? I know you talked about it as far as here, which is really important because even though we're talking about something very specific in this paper, or you talked about something very specific in this paper, we can be exposed to those certain things here as well. And you mentioned plasticizers. I mean, we can talk about BPA, so bisphenol A. A lot of people, right? We've seen that in our Nalgene's that are no longer there. So that's great. There's lots and lots of companies who have removed these chemicals from their products, but not all of them have, which is why it's really important to talk about plastic. Because it's one of the major sources of toxins and chemicals that we can get not only on our skin, but also inside our bodies too. So let's kind of transition over to what they're exposed to potentially overseas. Because I work with a population of veterans as well, and military. So I think this is a really important topic to talk about. And we'll kind of try to tie it in with how this can apply if you're not in the military. But go ahead and talk about how are they kind of exposed to potentially overseas and what kind of impacts might that have?
So what I found as doing my research was that with the Stockholm Convention, Afghanistan and Iraq both did sign on to the treaty, but they didn't do so until 2013 and 2016. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan started in around, I think, 2001 and 2003. So that's a 12 to 13 years of them not eradicating these from the environment. And when you're in a war zone and things are being blown up and destroyed, there are a lot of transformer facilities that were destroyed, which Afghanistan actually reported to the Stockholm Convention in their plan for eradicating this. Additional exposures or concerns, that was stated as one of them. So with a lot of the destruction of these facilities, they know that there was increased pollution into the soil, into the water, some air combustion, which has already been an issue in Kabul, which is where a lot of people were deployed to and stationed at. So that's one of the ways that they could be exposed, just environmentally, just not even anything else that you're considering, but just living there for extended periods of time.
Right. So, okay. So let's kind of segue into traumatic brain injury, oxidative stress. There were a couple of things that you highlighted that I want to dive into, because when we're talking about detoxification and you already touched on it. So just for a little background on liver health and GI health and why all these systems really matter. So I'm going to go into this a bit. So in the liver, there's two phases of detoxification, phase 1 and phase 2. Phase one is essentially when something like a medication or a toxin or used up hormones, anything that your body needs to get out of its system, goes through and the liver mostly into this first stage. And that's where it's actually turned into something that's a reactive oxygen species. So it's actually more toxic than even the thing that it's trying to detox. And then when it goes into phase two, we're doing a lot more of, we're using antioxidants to create or to bind to that reactive oxygen species so that it can get into either the bloodstream again to be removed by the kidneys, the skin, or into the GI tract, so it can be removed that way. So that's why when Dr. Stephanie talked about how important it is that the body and the GI tract is able to eliminate those things in a timely manner and well, is because if that isn't happening, they can get actually reabsorbed back into the system, and then just create this sort of just loop that just doesn't really ever end. And that's where you really end up seeing some major issues when it comes to detoxification. I mean, picture if you've stored it in fat, right? And you have this, and you're maybe losing fat because you're trying to lose weight, or this is just a normal thing that, you know, the body does, is it burns fat. So it can release those toxins and chemicals into the system that it's been storing. I mean, that's even heavy metals. That's a really common way that people are exposed again and again to heavy metals, because they've been stored in fat. But those get released, you know, and then you go through the system. But if your body isn't able to eliminate them well, that's when we start to see some of the symptoms that come up with troubles with detoxification. So traumatic brain injury and oxidative stress, I'm kind of trying to segue into that a little bit. So we see traumatic brain injury here pretty often in the United States. We also know why a lot of soldiers are exposed and have traumatic brain injuries, because of all sorts of things that they're exposed to over there. Even though it's hypothetical, how could being exposed to a toxin also, or a chemical, how could that potentially increase symptoms from traumatic brain injuries or post-traumatic stress disorder like PTSD? Like, how could that be connected?
So it can be compounded. So when you have a traumatic I mean, it can happen by itself, but the big connection, especially with soldiers, is when you have a traumatic brain injury, whether it's mild or not, they've shown in research that you have an increase in the blood-brain barrier, or permeability, and blood-brain barrier permeability. So your blood-brain barrier is basically like cheesecloth. There are very small micronutrients that can get through, only things that are necessary. And when you have a tear in that, or a widening of it, it can cause larger particles that are harmful to the brain to get through. And because the brain needs so much energy and it's constantly processing things, it has a higher probability of creating the reactive oxygen species and reactive nitrogen species. So one way for that to happen is through this traumatic brain injury. And with multiple ones, if you're not repairing that blood-brain barrier, it can just compound on itself. But there's also been limited research, mostly in animal models, to show that exposure to PCBs causes increased permeability in the blood-brain barrier. So if you are exposed, if you have a TBI in Afghanistan and you're exposed to more PCBs in the air and the environment, you could have that double whammy of now you have double the effect from both of those. Hypothetically.
Hypothetically. Let's make sure we make that's very clear. It's hypothetical.
No one's running to their doctors and saying, I have both these things and I saw this YouTube video.
No.
But it could cause, and they've shown specifically in the military population that about 175,000 soldiers have reported having TBIs while they were overseas between 2000 and 2013. And they estimate about 50% of medical records from returning soldiers having either PTSD, TBI, and or depression. And if you're ever, one of the biggest things that is an issue right now for returning Afghan and Iraqi vets is what they call the polytrauma triad. So it's PTSD, TBI, and pain some kind of musculoskeletal pain issue.
Mhm.
So being able to get a handle on those first two, the PTSD, the TBI, is a huge thing. And some of it could be because of this blood-brain barrier disruption.
Sure, sure. And maybe even linking that to a little bit that all of this can bear with me here, but a lot of this can kind of increase inflammation in the body, right?
Mhm.
So when we're looking at, the I think a lot of research in mental health is really starting to look more into how the whole body interacts with mental health. So I think maybe some of our some of the listeners have kind of heard that the brain, there's like a second brain that kind of goes to the gut, right? And that we're starting to look at the connection between the two, and the gut doesn't necessarily cause issues all the time with mental health, but inflammatory markers can be a part of why we experience certain things. So I want to talk a little bit more about what those are and how we can potentially tackle things like traumatic brain injury and PTSD with just looking at lowering inflammation in the body as a whole.
Mhm.
Can you?
And to connect this back to just the general population.
Yeah, please, let's do that. Yeah.
When you have children or even adults who have mild TBIs, so people who play, that's a huge thing right now, contact sports,
Yep.
kids getting concussions playing soccer or hockey or football, or
Right.
pick a sport, you can basically get a concussion. Those can compound on each other. So getting kids back into play without letting their brain fully heal could lead to bigger issues down the road.
Absolutely.
In regard to inflammation, chronic inflammation, in regard to neuroinflammation, neurodegeneration, all of those things could be impacted.
Absolutely. And I think also a really important piece here is that with kiddos, you won't always see those symptoms pop up right away. So what happens with kids is their brains are very, very fluffy. they have they have a lot of extra tissue because they're growing. But what happens when we get to about 25 to 30 is that some of that tissue starts to degenerate. And then some of those injuries that are there from being kids, from when we've had concussions, if they've never actually been addressed, they can be there. And then that's when so this is why we look at history. This is why it's so important to kind of look at a full timeline of what what they've been exposed to and what they've been going through, because these random symptoms can pop up at 25 to 30 years old that don't really make any sense. But when you start to look back, you can see, if they've played contact sports or they've been in some type of job environment, something like that, that's, brought them to a point where they've maybe had several concussions or just traumatic exposure, they can start to pop up. And then it's sometimes a little bit tricky to figure out why somebody is experiencing some of these things. But you start to lose some of that fluffy tissue that's kind of protecting that spot, and then it starts to show up. So yes, it's really, I think this is a conversation that a lot more people are having right now, just because of football and because of a lot of these contact sports, that we're starting to see the impact that concussions can have long-term and repetitive over time. One, maybe not so bad, but if you have them repetitively back to back to back to back, your brain's more susceptible first off to getting a concussion. And then second, you're just putting more and more trauma into the brain. And that's not just caused from like food or diet or anything like that. That's specific trauma from outside in. And that's going to increase inflammation in that way, right? So kind of separating those two, that yes, you can get inflammation from lifestyle and diet, but you can also get inflammation just from trauma itself. It's like when we get a cut, right, on our skin. I think this is hopefully this is okay. But I think when we look at the brain, we don't always see it. We see the outward exposure of trauma to the brain on the outside in behavior and in ways that we feel and ways that we think. But when we see like a broken bone, we know that somebody's injured. You know what I mean? So that you feel that inflammation and you see it when it gets all puffy and red and there's blood rushing to that area. That's inflammation due to an injury. That's a okay thing. That's supposed to happen. Acute inflammation is a good thing, but it's chronic inflammation that's not so great. That's where you usually start to see some of the bigger pieces of systemic pain. You see a lot of other different types of symptoms come from that. So
I think also with the brain, like with your point with like having a cut and realizing like, oh, there's something wrong and this is injured. The brain, a lot of things that are associated with brain, unless you have some massive head trauma or stroke or something that is very, very specific and significant, it's hard to notice those changes because we're a society now where not being able to pay attention for long periods of time can come and go. Being slightly fatigued is common. These small things like being in a depressed mood is common. And
super common.
You may see this just happen slowly. And to be able to connect, if you had 5 concussions while you were playing soccer in high school, and then 10 years later, you now were chronically depressed and having difficulty with paying attention or with motivation, it's hard, like you said, hard to connect those things because it probably was this gradual decline. And then you don't really know how you got here. You just woke up one day and realized that this really wasn't, this really isn't normal.
Right. Yes. So, and I think, but I don't want to brush past that though, because that is something that like patients walk in with that fairly often. I mean, I can't sleep. I am just not feeling like myself. I'm fatigued all day long. I'm worried. I'm anxious. Like I can't get to
focus. I lose my keys all the time and my phone and my.
Yes. Yes. I can't focus at work. It's very difficult for me to spend a certain amount of time doing something when potentially, they never experienced that before in their life. It's not something to necessarily brush past, and I think when we're looking from like a functional medicine perspective, this is why it's so important to be looking at a full timeline and a full history of really what's going on. I spend, and you also practice functional medicine as well. And, we spend a really decent amount of time with our patients looking at where these things are coming from, because, you just can't get that in a 5 to 10 minute appointment. It's very difficult to really root out where these things are coming from unless you're looking for them, so.
And ask the right questions, because people aren't necessarily going to offer up or remember or think that it's important that they had 5 concussions or whatever it is.
Yes. Absolutely. Yes. Oh yeah. I mean, the many times that I've gone through an appointment with somebody, and then a couple appointments down the road, they go, oh yeah, that one time. They'll be like, oh yeah, that would have been good to tell me 2 appointments ago. Oh, I love it. But we're all the same way. We don't know or think that these things are connected, which is why we're talking about it today. Okay, so let's lead into oxidative stress a bit, why these kinds of injuries can increase our oxidative stress, and then what we can potentially do about it. Because I think it's great to talk about these things and educate, but I also think that we want some type of direction to go. If somebody has something like this, or if they know of somebody who's had a traumatic brain injury, or they've had some type of exposure to chemicals or toxins or any slew of these symptoms, what can they do about it? So let's dive into oxidative stress. What is it and how does it connect?
So oxidative stress occurs when you have different processes inside your body that are going to produce reactive oxygen species, reactive nitrogen species, and these are normal. They're part of energy processes and part of detoxification, and this is part of the process of breaking down things to get rid of them. What can happen though is it can get held up in that state of being a reactive oxygen species, a reactive nitrogen species, and they can actually cause cell death and damage to your DNA. And that's really the big component of it, is not that oxidative stress is bad because it's necessary for good things to happen. It's when you have too much of it is when it becomes an issue. So what can happen is this increase in oxidative stress, particularly in the brain, can cause this neurodegeneration and cell death to brain cells, brain structures, that can result in depressive features, can result in memory lapses, can result in issues with neurotransmitter function. So the things that you think about, dopamine, serotonin, which people have heard about, can affect the processes of synthesizing these neurotransmitters, degrading them, can get involved with that. It can also cause a depletion in your antioxidants, which also people know a lot about, because when you have too much, those antioxidants are going to try to combat that and lower them down. So it's this whole synergistic thing where when it gets elevated, it starts to cause a bunch of other things to happen outside on the periphery, which can then compound the effects.
Yeah, that's great. So, and yeah, no, that's great. So, I do think it's important. I think we hear a lot about stress, right? We hear a lot about oxidative stress. We hear, you definitely have heard of them. You've heard of reactive oxygen species. You've heard of, the reasons why you need to be consuming antioxidants and colorful foods. You've definitely heard of them before, but they're there for a reason. They are naturally supposed to be there. They are created by the body going through a process to either create energy or eliminate something out of the body. So it's not, we don't need to make a villain out of stress or oxidative stress, because they are designed to be there for a reason, or even inflammation for that matter. It is designed to be there for when it is needed. It's when these things get out of control that they become an issue. So when we have an increase in oxidative stress, there are foods that we can eat that will support the body's ability to remove them from the body. And keeping in mind, remember when we went back to talking about the liver, this is that second stage of liver detoxification, just specifically. There's a bunch of different areas where reactive oxygen species are in the body. But for example, in the liver, when we are going through that second phase, we have a certain amount of antioxidants that we need in order to remove that from the system. So what kinds of foods, what kinds of things are we talking about as far as, people can be eating these on a daily basis, regardless of whether they have traumatic brain injury or PTSD or anything like that? What are some foods they can eat that would help them support this detoxification system and removal of toxins?
So I would say specifically in regard to the research that I did for brain health, what was found that it was people who had increased markers of oxidative stress tend to have increased symptoms of depression.
Yeah.
And of the people who, they did some studies looking at those oxidative stress markers and the levels, and then treating people with SSRIs, or serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Right. And the people who had the lower baseline levels had a better response to the SSRIs compared to those who had higher levels. So it shows that these do play a role in the depressive symptoms. They've also found that vitamin D is a huge thing, which is also being researched a bunch in regard to depression. So anything lower than 30 nanograms per milliliter can produce some usually it's depressive symptoms, but it could be some memory or other issues. So getting those back up is a huge thing. Vitamin E is probably one of the most powerful antioxidants in the body. So to be able to impact cell death, which they did some animal studies to show that people who were exposed to PCBs and had some neuronal cell death, they actually regenerated some of that or prevented it with vitamin D.
Vitamin E or vitamin D?
Vitamin E, sorry, vitamin E front loading. Right. Resveratrol is a huge antioxidant. There's not a ton of research on like the actual specific physiological mechanism of all of it, but it has been shown to decrease oxidative stress and increase neuronal functioning and neurotransmitter functioning. And then quercetin is a huge antioxidant, and supporter.
Mhm. Which is also very helpful for mitochondrial health as well. So creating energy, reducing fatigue, all that kind of jazz. Okay. So we can get some of these or we can get some of these from food. We can get them from supplements and things like that. I think this is why it's also very important to work with a practitioner
Get
to,
tested.
yes, get tested.
Have tests.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. There is a test that you and I both use that really shows where certain levels of vitamins and minerals are. But I do want to stress, I think one last time before we kind of segue into the rest, is that it's super important to work with a practitioner on these things because, when somebody has an acute traumatic brain injury, you actually want the inflammation to be there and to stay for a little bit, because you don't want to be taking things that are anti-inflammatory in many ways, because your brain needs to heal. And so you need that inflammatory process to do its thing. But then there's a certain point in time when you can start taking certain anti-inflammatories to start, going through the process of repairing. But this is why it's so important to get to somebody that does specialize in these things, in traumatic brain injuries, in brain health, and also in nutrition and things like that as well. That's going to be able to support you across the board when we're looking at this. But as far as detoxification goes, and with chemicals and toxins, nutrition is going to be a really big way to help remove some of these from the system. And also, you don't want to start a detoxification process if the GI tract isn't healthy. You're not going to be able to remove those toxins. And so just make sure that if you are thinking this is me, get to a practitioner that really understands, how all of these are connected and what's going on. And don't be surprised if they say, oh, we're not starting there yet.
Yeah.
So yeah, super important to make sure that all the systems are functioning well. But it's a very good picture of, how the liver, how the GI tract, how the brain can all be connected, and how some of those symptoms that you're experiencing in different areas might all be caused from something something that's connecting all the dots. Well, for funsies, do you want to talk a little bit about testing and why, and this maybe a couple certain tests that might be available for people to kind of explore a little bit more as far as what might be going on for them?
So there are some tests. I personally have not delved into this very far, but I know that there are tests that can look at your neurotransmitters, how you're breaking them down. You can do urine tests to see the byproducts. One of them is you can look at homovolinic acid specifically to look at dopamine, which is another part of the paper we really didn't touch on, but dopamine levels can be impacted by both PCBs and TBIs. So looking into something like that, if you are having some brain stuff going on, to see how your neurotransmitters are being broken down, because a lot of your neurotransmitters can also be impacted by precursors to that. So for dopamine specifically, the phenylalanine and tyrosine that you need in order to progress into dopamine could be an issue. You could have a rate limiting step with tyrosine hydroxylase, which needed to convert it. You could also be breaking down and catabolizing your dopamine too quickly. And that is why you're having issues. So being able to identify the different steps and what nutrients are needed there is important. And some of that can be identified through something like a urine test that tells you the different byproducts and what levels they're at. Like we spoke about before, doing a comprehensive GI examination, a laboratory test, whatever, stool analysis, something that's going to tell you exactly what's going on in your gut. You could have issues with absorption. And if you're having issues with absorption, the nutrients I just spoke about may not serve you any purpose, because if you can't absorb them, then they're not going to be utilized.
But also on top of that, if you're not being able to absorb them, that also may be a compounding factor as to why you're experiencing the symptoms you are. Like, you may have had the traumas, you may have had exposures, you may have had all of these things, but one person isn't experiencing them at all, but the other person is, right? And that might be because they're not getting the nutrients they need. And either that's because they're not eating enough of them, or maybe they just can't absorb them. So you see how all of these things are all connected.
And it could be that, like, you have some kind of issue with microbial, the makeup of your microbiome could be off, but it could also be that you have some kind of sensitivity or hypersensitivity to a food, which is causing increase in the gut lining to allow food to process through. So you're having an increase in tight junction, which is a whole different thing. So that's why it's important to do the testing, because otherwise you're taking probiotics, and when the probiotics don't work, you switch to something else that you read about online, then you switch to something else, and then you end up spending however much it is for that lab test on supplements that have not worked. And then you do the lab test anyways, and then you're still not feeling well.
Yes. And the time, right? You know, of trying to go through all of these things, you know, it just, you could know, you know, in the next couple weeks.
Yeah. And then the other major one, which we've talked about before, is looking at mitochondrial function. So looking at micronutrients and also the byproducts of just energy creation within the body, and seeing where there might be a holdup in that system, because that not only will affect your energy, but it'll also affect your brain's ability to repair, because that same system, which everyone's learned about in biology, the Krebs cycle and the electron transfer chain and all of that stuff, requires so many nutrients. And that's where some of the reactive oxygen species can be created. And so you want that to be working so that you get rid of those reactive oxygen species when they're not needed anymore, and you're able to repair tissues that have been damaged. So those would probably be my top 3 for someone who is having something going on, brain related, TBI related, would be something with neurotransmitter, something with mitochondrial micronutrient functions, and then GI.
Perfect. That's probably what I would run as well.
Along with your basic lab test, your basic blood laboratories.
Yes. And I know I've talked about that before as well, but a lot of those basic labs that are run, they actually do tell you a lot, even if they are within normal range. If they're low or high in those normal ranges, or if they're just outside, they can tell you much more than just something's off. You know, sometimes those are connected to different vitamin and mineral levels.
I mean, a huge one for not just for oxidative stress would be uric acid, which is can be run on just a regular lab panel, and can be run through your primary care doctor on your insurance. And if it's low, it's probably telling you that your body's working really, really, really hard to downregulate some of that oxidative stress.
Oh, yes, absolutely. That's so good. Awesome. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on before we wrap up? Any last comments?
I can't think of anything.
I mean, I think we kind of dove into a lot of different stuff. Yeah. I love it. Well, I hope that our listeners enjoy this. I certainly did. Thank you so much for being here. If people want to find you, do you have any do you have a social media or website or anything?
I do not have any social media accounts that are business related, but I could leave an email address if people want to contact me or ask for any research on the papers that I discussed.
Yeah, you know what we'll do is we'll link some of the research below, and then if people have questions, they can just ask a question on any of my social media or on this YouTube channel. You can leave a comment, and we can make sure that people get their questions answered. That'll be just fine. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Stephanie. It was a pleasure having you. I'm so excited to do this. And hopefully we'll be able to do it again. I'm sure there will be other things.
I'm sure there'll be more things.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.